So just to let you all know, this is being broadcast live on Google. It will be archived on YouTube after we're done. So it's embarrassing. So my name is Evan Kirksey, and I want to welcome you all to the Multispecies Salon. It's a series of discussions and art shows that started in San Francisco, moved to New Orleans, and then New York City, and now we're here at Princeton for the year. So today we've got a number of wonderful guests. We have Dafna Shir Dafna, who's joining us from Israel. Peter Singer, here to my right. Craig Campbell, who comes to us from UT Austin by way of Cornell. And also Lori Gruen, who's on the line in New Haven right now. So the event today is fleshing out this lively lexicon that we're creating in collaboration with the Environmental Humanities Journal in Sydney, Australia. And what we're trying to do is create these keywords for multispecies studies, this emergent field. So the Multispecies Salon is creating a kind of alphabet that reaches into the biological as well as the etymological, containing both roots and rhizomes. Authors of this multispecies ABCs are moving beyond the domain of ethnography to bring in key morphemes from geography, ecology, archaeology, history, queer theory, and allied intellectual traditions. So you can find this living lexicon online at multispeciessalon.org, and out there you'll find that letters stand for more than one word. So A is for animal as well as anthropos, B is for becoming as well as buzz, C is for care and charisma. And there's a lot of other keywords on there, everything from microbiopolitics to labor to double death to spectacular to swarm and wild. So today we're going to be talking about Dafna's wonderful article. She's coined this notion of flexible personhood to understand how animals exist in human households. And if I may, I'm going to just sort of give a little background to your concept, Dafna, before inviting you to sort of chime in and flesh it out yourself. But one of the key reference points to understand this notion of flexibility today is David Harvey, who has written about flexible accumulation under late capitalism. So this rests on a flexibility with respect to labor processes, labor markets, products, and patterns of consumption. It's characterized by the emergence of an entirely new sector of production, new ways of providing financial services, new markets, and above all, intensified rates of commercial, technological, and organizational innovation. And what this notion of flexible accumulation is trying to do, in part, is make visible the precarious nature of labor under a certain form of capital. And I think what Dafna is showing is, in part, just this precarious status of pets in human households, how in certain moments they're called babies, and other moments abandoned by the roadside or given into the humane society where they're euthanized. There's a related term that Harvey uses to understand that situation of laborers in the contemporary economy, and that's precarity. So he's trying to understand people who produce and reproduce urban life that look at their condition as being insecure. There's a lot of temporary labor, which is different from conventional factory work, where you had a good paying union job, you could depend on your paycheck, you would have a pension at the end of your life. But there's this new emerging labor force that is ever in this precarious situation. So I think with that, Dafna, I'm going to sort of invite you to jump in here and just sort of explain what you mean by flexible personhood. In this keyword entry, you talk about the separation between self and other, human and animals, that it's tacit and crossed, and it creates this shared social space of perception of we-ness. You say that animals as persons can expand the possibilities of interconnectedness, provide emotional outlets, and new forms of bond. So with that, I think I'll just let you jump in and talk about this really lovely essay.
Okay, thank you. I lose you every couple of seconds, so I hope you'll hear me properly. I think you fleshed out really nicely the idea of flexibility, so maybe it would be interesting to start with a question, what is a person? And I know that Peter, for example, dealt with that question, and I see it a little bit differently. So there are a lot of different ways of thinking about what is a person. Is it a human being? Is it an aware creature? Is it, like Peter says, someone that can anticipate a future and have a certain sense of what it wants in the future. I really like what Knight says about personhood, and also Pun says about personhood, is that it is something that someone gets. It's not something that someone has. That is, it is created through relationships. And when you relate with another living creature, then you can be ascribed personhood, but it can also be taken away. And that's basically what I'm showing in this article. When I talk about flexible personhood, I guess the bottom line is that people love animals, and they really love animals, and they cuddle them and hug them and kiss them and give them names and see them as babies, but then they don't. And at a certain place in time, they just don't love these animals anymore, at least not in the same way. And it's not because they want to hurt them. It's not because they don't respect the well-being of the animal. It's because there's a more alluring love object or subject, which is usually the human baby. And these transformations basically show us the boundaries that exist between humans and animals to begin with. That is, loving the animal doesn't mean that we're really crossing any boundaries. The boundaries are there. And within these boundaries, we can flexibly change our relationship with them. Sometimes love them, see them as babies, ascribe them personhood, and then at other times renegotiate their role as animals and say, oh yeah, they bark, they scratch, they're bugging us, and we can't really take care of them right now, so maybe we'll give them away. I hope that's clear. Maybe that's a good starting point.
Yeah, and maybe I'll use that computer end. So we've written a lot, and some draft this article and ethnic record with these spaces in home.
Sure. And let me say I certainly enjoyed the article in terms of telling us a lot about how pets relate to animals at certain times. Now, the change of circumstances can alter to animals. Having a baby or was change of circumstances is likely to provide that kind of change. But I do think, from different disciplines, we need to try and be clear about what we are doing when we are talking about persons and who is a person and can there be flexible persons. As Dafna just said, we're using this term in rather different ways. You're using it to say that to be a person, or you're following Knight's saying it's something that you get, not something that you have. It's created through relationships, it's described, it can be granted and it can be taken away. But I want to point out that that's actually something that ought to make us quite uncomfortable, and it's certainly not, I think, the way we normally use the term person. So, for instance, if one of these families thought about their child when she was 2, that she was a nuisance, she was bugging them, she cries a lot, she's not toilet trained yet or whatever, and therefore said, okay, so she's not a person, we'll put her outside in the backyard and let her fend for herself, we would all be horrified by that, and we would, one of the reasons why we would be horrified about that is we would say, but she is a person. You can't say she's not a person just because she's a nuisance to you and you don't love her anymore. You don't love her anymore, and you don't want to have relationships with her. And obviously there are other historical examples where we know that people have denied the personhood of, say, in particular, Africans during the era of slavery. And we think that was wrong, and we think it was wrong precisely because they were persons, no matter what the slave traders or slave owners said of them, they were persons. So I think there's a sense that we understand well in which being a person is not simply a matter of ascription. That sense is quite an ancient one. So the idea of person, I think, really entered our notion through, originally through in Roman times when the persona was the mask that an actor wore. And from then it got used in early Christian theology, which had to develop this rather tricky idea of the Trinity, which is three persons in one. So we had to know what's the idea of a person here. And it's obviously not identical with human being, because of the Trinity, only one of those is or was a human being. So there has to be some other notion when you say that God is three persons in one. And the idea of that, which goes back to Boethius, is sort of a rational substance, a thinking rational being in some sense. And that's taken up a little more precisely by John Locke in the 17th century, who says that a person is a thinking being that is aware of itself as the same substance over time. That's paraphrased, not an exact quote. And I've used that and taken that up, and I think that that's a useful term in terms of understanding what might distinguish those beings we think of as persons from those beings who are not persons. And that's not to say that beings who are not persons don't count morally. I think there are, for example, non-human animals who are capable of feeling pain and suffering, who would not be persons in Locke's sense. And I certainly think that they matter morally, and there's things that we can do that are wrong for them. But still, there is this other notion which we think has some moral significance in terms of being a person who is aware of themselves over time, plan for the future, and so on. And I think it's important to recognise that it's not only human beings who meet that criterion of personhood. That indeed, there are some humans, none of us were born persons, I believe, and there are some non-human animals who do meet it. The great apes would probably be the most obvious examples, but I'm sure there are other species as well. So I think it's important to use that as well. And you're talking about that. Sometimes they treat these animals, their pets, as if they were persons, as if they were members of the family, and at other times they don't. But the question of whether that's wrong, whether we should think of them as persons, whether the dog is still a person even if he's no longer loved and the family wants to give that dog up for somebody else, I think that's still an open question.
So maybe just to sort of lay out the different disciplinary knowledges that you bring to the table. So we've basically got two philosophers on the line. We've got Peter here and Lori joining us virtually. And then we've sort of got three on two here. So and we've, I think, got a very different notion of personhood in anthropology. So over lunch, one of the things that came up informally was the Nuer's flexible notion of personhood. So in this really classic anthropology text called Nisa, you learn that humans don't become persons until they try. Basically, in the first 5 years of an infant's life, it's sort of this liminal stage where the life is often lost. And I think in part that delayed sort of sense of what becoming a person means is grappling with that very difficult social and psychological fact of the precarious nature of early life.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah. That, to me, what you said so far doesn't show that the Nuer have a flexible notion of personhood. It just shows that they have a different criteria rather later. You become a person rather later. And, I could easily imagine that you have a later person. You need more than just that sort of self-awareness that we're talking about. But would the Nuer ever take it away? I mean, if somebody after 5 in some way is ostracized, does the Nuer then think that they're not a person anymore?
Yeah, I don't know the Nuer situation well enough. But I think I might let Craig jump in here. And I think what what Dafna's done really well is sort of situate the idiosyncratic notion of what a person is in these Israeli households. So, I think in Israel, folks share a general sort of European philosophical heritage, a Judeo-Christian sort of background, and what we see ethnographically is sort of how people are making sense of these imperative categories and applying them in the intimate spaces of their homes. So Craig, I think I'll let you sort of jump in and either ask Dafna or Peter or anyone questions or comments.
Okay, thanks very much. So, I mean, my first question coming into this really is, what do we want personhood to do? And how do we see it operating within the Israeli context? How do we think it's operating in our own rhetoric? And how is it supposed to operate within sort of philosophical framework? Peter, I think what you were talking about. And one of the questions I have, particularly in relationship to what is personhood, is pulling and exploring this idea of flexibility itself. So, for instance, why not disposable personhood? What does flexibility give us that some other modifier doesn't necessarily give us? Why is flexible so appealing as a way of talking about personhood? And so I guess I want to flip that back to Dafna and say, flexible appeals to me in a lot of ways. We like flexible categories. It appeals to our sense that the world is much more chaotic and strange and ineffable than we think. Yet at the same time, I think that flattery for me is a flag in some ways. So I'm kind of curious, with the flexibility of personhood there, with these animals, with these pets, doesn't necessarily to me tell us a whole lot about personhood necessarily. So I guess I'd flip it back to Dafna and say, why not disposable person? And yeah, can you answer that or talk a little bit about that from that angle?
Sure. The idea I talk about, the reason I talk about flexibility rather than disposability is because it keeps changing. In the article, I show how it changes from different categories of child or semi-child or pre-child, but also afterwards, and I only imply that in the article itself, but I write about that more at length in other places. The animal can return to be a person and a child, and we especially see it when the children leave the home. Then suddenly I see elderly people showing me pictures of their kids, and their kids are not human. So they re-return in different places, and also their personhood is accented in certain situations and then denied in others. So they can still say this is a person, but not my person, not my kid. Or they can say it's a vacuum cleaner. Or they can say, right now I can't deal with it, I'll give it up for adoption to a different family. So there are different ways that are flexible, that move between these categories and are not an either-or situation. And it can be blurred. And it's also important for me to stress why flexibility and not ambiguity, as you said. You said it's a complicated world, a complex world, it's very ambiguous. But for me, flexibility is not ambiguity. So when we talk about ambiguity, for example, Peter, you asked about the newer and what happens when they're not persons. And Mary Douglas very famously wrote about the newer babies that when they're born monstrous births, as she called it, they're considered to be something between animal and persons, and they're called baby hippos. And they're put out on the river and are basically abandoned. And what she was trying to show is that people don't like ambiguity. And in fact, I think that that's what I try to do in my work as well, and maybe we can enhance on that a little bit later, is show that what the people here are doing is very, very clear. That is, when we treat the animal as a baby, we're not really mixed up. We know exactly what the animal is. We know all the time that it is an animal. We're not breastfeeding it. We're not marrying it. And I think one of my favorite examples, I mean, it's a horrible one, but I love using it in classrooms to show when people tell me, when my students say, oh, my animal really is my baby. And I tell them about the story that I think it was in Sanders' book about a hairdresser from Texas that had a Rottweiler. And she was crazy about this Rottweiler, and at some point she also had a human baby. And when the baby was 3 weeks old, the Rottweiler ate the baby, killed it in some way. And when they came to take the dog away, as they usually do if a dog kills a human being, then she screamed and yelled, I can always have another baby, but I'll never be able to replace my Rottweiler. And the reason I love this example, even though it's horrible, is because people gasp and they look shocked and they know that this woman is completely confused because she's really confused about what the role of her dog should be and what the role of the baby should be. And when we get too confused and the transgression is real, and maybe we can talk a little bit later, for example, about zoophilia as a way of really transgressing these boundaries, then we are punished. Then we'll be imprisoned or put in a madhouse or be outcast in some way because these boundaries really do need to be clear. And in the case of flexibility, these people are not doing anything wrong. They celebrate it. They laugh about it. The only time they feel embarrassed is when they're abandoning the animal or changing its status after the human baby is born. They love saying that the animal is a baby to them or like a baby to them because they're playing within very set boundaries that are legitimate, that keep the animal as subordinate, as baby-like, as something that we can control, that gives us unconditional love, that has obligations towards us, and we have certain obligations towards the animal, but we can also change that. And that's why I'm using the notion of flexibility, because it allows me to play within these set of boundaries to show how these changes occur, but still show that they're not contradictory in any way. To love an animal and to abuse an animal, to me, is not necessarily a different thing. It's parts of the same treatment. Because when we love animals, we love them ourselves. We don't necessarily love them when we treat an animal as a baby, when we give it names and we cuddle it. We're not necessarily thinking, is this what the animal wants? We're thinking about what we want and what we get. And I guess that's what I'm showing in this article. And you've asked, both of you, also Peter, is this something we should do? Is this wrong in any way? And as an anthropologist, I'm not saying, look, this is wrong and this is how we should treat animals. But yes, of course there is a certain sense of criticism here in saying we are using these animals. Even when we love them, even when we shower them with affection, it is still, they're still our tools. So Levi-Strauss talked about animals as symbolic tools, and I talk about animals as emotional tools. And this flexibility allows them to be incredible emotional tools and gives them a great cultural significance because we can play around with them and give ourselves opportunities to love and be loved that we don't necessarily get, at least temporarily.
I'll let Lori jump in, and
Yeah.
by way of introduction, I'll also say that Lori is going to offer us a keyword in the spring, E for entangled empathy. So, Lori, I know you've also thought a lot about these questions.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, everyone. So I think that the flexibility idea is a really useful idea, but I wonder if the personhood idea is the right connection here. Because it seems to me that one of the things that might be useful in thinking through this is that what we're talking about is flexible families, not necessarily flexible persons. And so, for example, I think what Peter said about sort of the horror we might have when we set a 2-year-old outside because they haven't been potty trained yet, but I don't think they usually do get potty trained by 2. But the idea here, I think, is an interesting one to think about in terms of the flexibility of the family. And I think that part of what Dafna's doing is talking a little bit about, for me, that's what came out. If you imagine you're in a long-term relationship and you decide, a long-term monogamous relationship, and you decide you want to take another lover or open your relationship or become polyamorous. It's not really that your primary partner necessarily becomes a non-person. They just become, you know, your first partner. Maybe you'll have a second partner. Maybe you'll have a third partner. Children certainly in families go through different, I think you mentioned this, Dafna, too, in terms of adoption. You might have a brother, you might have a biological child and then an adopted child and then another adopted child. It might turn out that by your 9th child, you're not going to actually be able to raise that child and you'll adopt that child. You might have an open adoption, and whereby you have multiple parents engaged in different kinds of relationships with children. So it seems to me that other animals can be a part of that schema as well. And so I wasn't really convinced that while it was true that the effective economy of the family changed when human infants were born, and I thought your telling of those stories was really poignant, it's not clear to me why the change in the relationship with the animals is necessarily a change in their personhood as opposed to a change in the kinship structure. And also, one of the things I did want to note that's not in your discussion, but I would love to hear what you had to say about it, is, you know, when you live with other animals, when you first have them and they're young, they're like babies. Or maybe you'll think of them as more like infants, although I do think there's a worry about infantilizing animals. As they get older, we're in a different relationship of care with those older animals. And I can just be a little autobiographical, but I spent the last fall, a year ago, pretty much actually, it was about 6 months' time, in elder care of my older dog, who was in renal failure for quite a long time before she passed. And that's a very similar sort of relationship, but it's nothing like the children relationship, and it's nothing like the sort of I'm getting all this love from them. It's actually a reversal where I'm doing a tremendous amount of care, as I might a parent or a partner who's ill, or to some extent a child who is sort of gravely ill. So it seems to me that the idea here, it would be interesting to see why you didn't think about this in terms of flexible family or flexible kinship structure, as opposed to flexible person. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
So maybe I'll insert a little bit of my own sort of ethnographies of multi-species families and then turn it back to Dafna for her response. For me, I think the notion of personhood and this idea that pets might be flexible people really gets clear when you start looking at multi-species context, where it's not just dogs. So I think we all agree that dogs and people have a special sort of shared social space that people might not have with other species. One of the sites that I work is in Florida, and I looked at these multi-species households that also involve things like snakes and frogs and birds, and basically found that some kinds of animals were more flexible as persons than others. So snakes aren't very personable. When you're living in a human household as a snake, often you just want to die. So ball pythons are named for the fear response. They spend a lot of their lives when they live with people curled up in a ball, and that's what they do when they're afraid. I spend a lot of time with people who breed chondropythons, and a related kind of snake that basically doesn't get along very well at all in people's houses. They like to fight. They also fall up on themselves, and basically people have figured out how to make them live, even though they want to die. So the snakes basically stop eating. So the people who invest a lot of money, you can make $10,000 or $20,000 off of a single snake that has some rare color mutations. So what you do when your snake wants to die is you grab it behind the neck, you take that baby rat, and you jam it down its throat past the gag reflex and put it back with the snake spits out the rat. So frogs are somewhere in the middle. Frogs, you know, they're not very personable, but my frog Steve, he liked my partner better than me. Like when she was talking on the phone, we would sing along and rah, rah, rah. So there's some sort of shared sociality, but frogs don't generally have, you know, like when they're on their own, just amongst their own species, like they don't do much with each other besides mate. When I started interviewing this one lady who had a lot of birds in her double-wide mobile home outside of Miami, I first thought that it was just sort of this anthropomorphic imposition. Like she talked about her babies, and it seemed like she was just sort of putting Anglo-American kinship terms on animals. But as we were talking, all of a sudden a budgie, an Australian budgie, flew out of nowhere and started mating with her hand. So it became really clear that this wasn't just an anthropocentric or anthropomorphic projection on animal worlds, but that there was another kind of projection going on onto the human. And I think, Daphne, we're seeing similar sorts of things with dogs. I think that, you know, certain kinds of parrots, like dogs, have an affinity for the human and might enter these shared social spaces, even though the projections, you know, whether it's human projections of personhood or budgie projections of maybe budgiehood or canine projections of, you know, like what is the dog projecting? I think this is an interesting question too.
Absolutely. And I always feel a little bit guilty that the animals aren't more present in my research, and my only explanation basically is that although I really love animals, researching humans is really what I know and love to do. So they're not more present in my research, and I don't really address their reactions to the humans more than just describing what I see. But of course, that is a very important part. But if I return, Lori, to what you asked, why, first of all, why flexible personhood and not flexible families? Well, obviously, yes, there is a lot of kinship issues here, and again, this is a small article, but I have dealt a lot with Weston, with Kenneth Weston and Families We Choose, and how, and I know, Eben, you have too, and how incorporating these animals is a form of choice. And what Weston, for example, talks about is this enduring commitment, that although these are not our flesh and blood, then we still have this obligation, commitment, enduring love towards them. And yes, relationships with humans end as well, and we can be estranged with our children or with our spouses and with our parents. But it's a little bit different with animals, and that's exactly why I discuss this as flexible personhood. Because what happens is that when we end our relationship with an animal, it's not, for the animal, it's not just that the relationship has ended. It means that no one will be, let me go back a little bit and say that being a person is not just about what we feel or what we attribute, but there's also rights and responsibilities that go with personhood. There's a legal status that goes with personhood. There's a sense, of course, of moral concern that goes with personhood. So, for example, and I think this is mentioned very shortly in the article, divorce courts are also in the States are grappling with this idea of animals when couples are getting divorced. Is the animal property or is it a person? And in many cases now they're starting to treat it as a person, also in Israel. That is, what will be the animal's best interests here? Okay, will it prefer being with a wife or with a husband, for example? But what happens is that when we end our relationships with animals, they're no longer our babies, then there will be no court that will ask what is in the animal's best interest. There will be no one that will give the animal a name. There will be no one that will be caring for it or thinking about its future unless it is reincorporated into another family. That is, the animal can be abandoned, left to die. Unfortunately, in many cases, it dies. Or is at least treated as a vacuum cleaner, as I show in my article, and no one is considering it to be a person vested with rights anymore. Maybe the right to not suffer, not always the case. We know that the leading cause, even in the United States, for dog and cat death is euthanasia, because they are being abandoned. So when these animals are not incorporated as babies anymore, it's not just that they're not part of the family as they used to be, but they're also really not treated as persons anymore. And again, it begins and ends with our definition of personhood, and you might not agree, but to these people, the animals are no longer persons, as they used to.
So leaving our differences about defining personhood aside, maybe, I was thinking it might be interesting to invite Peter to jump in here and talk about just the norms and laws that are at play in the human household that involves animals. So in Animal Liberation, he described how the Animal Welfare Act of 1970 sets some standards for cages. So these cages should provide sufficient space to allow each animal to make normal postural and social adjustments with adequate freedom of movement. And that act applied to zoos, circuses, wholesale pet dealers, and laboratories, but as you pointed out, not to animals being reared for food. And I was wondering if you could just comment about how our ethical norms and legal structures are playing out in human households with pets, and then also respond to this, this horrible fact that Dafna points out in the conclusion of her article. She says the Humane Society of the United States has an estimated 600 million dogs in free shelters each year. And these dogs are basically these animals that are no longer valued in this human household.
Yes. Okay. So there's a lot of different issues you've raised there. Here in the United States, there's no doubt that the legal status of non-human animals is as things, as items of property, and not as persons. You will have read about efforts by the Non-Human Rights Project, headed by Stephen Wise, to try to get courts to accept the idea that chimpanzees are persons. He's had a couple of cases which have looked interesting for a while. Most recent was at Long Island, Stony where a court, the judge at least, required the university to show why it should be able to hold chimpanzees that it was using in research, and that was progress, and that the judge didn't just throw the case out right from the start and say, well, obviously these are animals, and they belong to the university, so that's the end of it. But even so, we haven't got to the point of saying that non-human animals are more than things of law, items of property. The European Union is a little more advanced in this, in that it did include in its founding documents, the Treaty of Maastricht, the idea that animals have a status as sentient beings, which is not persons. So it's like a kind of intermediate status between property and persons. And so far, it isn't really clear exactly what legal significance that has. We haven't got very much case law as yet that's built up on that. But the kind of cases that Dafna mentioned in terms of divorce might be one example where it provides a basis for saying what's in the best interests of the sentient being in this case, rather than who owns it. But it's very limited. And as you just pointed out, Evan, when it comes to animals used in food, then we really have no status other than items of property, and pretty, at least again in this country, pretty limited regulation at all either. So that, as you said, there was legislation for zoos and laboratories and so on, which did not apply to farmed animals. And the only reason for that clearly is the political clout of farming states, and might say perhaps the interest of consumers in keeping prices low. So essentially there are a lot of animal protection laws, many of which are state laws, that's a federal act that you refer to, but many of which are state laws, which then have exceptions saying, but nothing in this act applies to animals who are being used in farming in accordance with accepted farming practices. Some vague phrase like that. Basically means if it's accepted farming practice to put 6 hens in a cage about 6 feet, then even though we've got legislation that says you mustn't crowd an animal, that's not contrary to that. And the same will be true of legislation that says you mustn't starve an animal, but if egg producers force molt their hens, which essentially means you cut off food and water to them for periods where obviously they're very thirsty and they're hungry, even if you don't quite kill them, there's the legislation doesn't apply to that either. So we're failing to recognise the animals that we use for food as sentient beings. And you asked about the abandonment of dogs and cats. That's certainly true in that area as well, that we can see at this level. Some families are failing to recognise them as being of interest. But at least I would say there is generally, with the majority of the public, there's a reaction that this is a bad thing, and people are disturbed at the idea of dogs and cats being abandoned. And I have to say, while that is disturbing, I think I'm much more disturbed by the failure to recognise the animals using food as being of interest. Perhaps if you want to use rights terminology, essentially being treated in the way because I think the figure you mentioned was 8 million, is that right? So in terms of animals still being put in the United States, it's over 9 billion. So we're talking about 1,000 times more animals being killed with food. And I would say typically having much worse lives themselves. So in terms of where the animal movement ought to focus, I think that it ought to focus on the animals that are not even flexible persons by anyone's standards, because at least when we're talking about what we ascribe to anyway on the view that Dafna was using, basically nobody is ascribing personhood to chickens or cows or pigs, although they're certainly all sentient beings, and arguably maybe some of them are persons as well.
I see you nodding, Dafna. Do you want to come back in?
Well, it's actually interesting that the animal rights movement, at least in Israel, and I'm sure in other countries, is trying to do exactly that and kind of show them as persons. So when they're talking about cows and calves, they're talking about breastfeeding and how you're taking, how no mother would want her baby to be taken away from her when she's still breastfeeding. And similar, juxtapositions like that, trying to show that these are persons. And actually the animal rights movement, the vegan movement, is very, very strong in Israel, even though we can find at the same time a lot of cruelty towards animals. So that's why I was nodding.
Lori, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's something really interesting and important and sort of the dark side, if you will, to personhood that we haven't really addressed, and I want to sort of raise it. And one of the things I really liked about Dafna's view was that it has a certain kind of relationality built in, so it's not either you're one thing or you're the other, but there's moments and times, as we know in reality, even with human persons, where you might be a person, then you might cease to be a person, and you might be a person again. I think one of the worries about sort of the intense focus on personhood, particularly legal personhood, is that it may close off the richness of the relationships that are very much a part of what gives meaning to our lives and the lives of other animals. So there's a sort of, at least legally speaking, there is a deeply sort of limiting way that persons and rights get ascribed. And so one of the things that is happening, and this is just what I was thinking about both in the Israeli vegan movement, but also in the farm animal movement, the sanctuary movement, and the vegan movement in this country, is that there's an important sense in which the campaigns are someone, not something, to try to recognize these individual animals as beings with all of these capacities that are similar to human capacities. They're smart, they're conscious, they're sentient, they can experience pains and pleasures. But what's, I think, crucial, and this is what I was getting at, is what's really crucial is that they're also in relationships with others, right? So they're mothers of children, they have friendship networks, they have family networks, and that one of the things that gets missed in this language of personhood is a focus on sort of these individual capacities that the animals have, can also lead us to forget the importance of the relationships they're in. I think that relationships are really important because their well-being, ultimately, their flourishing is largely going to depend on those relationships persisting. So what the focus on the child or the calf and his mother is an important relationship that we see, at least in sanctuaries, is really quite crucial. And we've all heard these stories of mother cows sort of crossing great distances to reunite with the infant that was taken away. I think those kinds of notions, and that gets back to what I was talking about in terms of flexible families, those kinds of notions are, I think, really important. I don't think it's necessarily antithetical to a discussion of personhood, but personhood tends to be somewhat contained and individualistic. And I think fundamentally there's an important sense that what matters both to us and what matters to other animals is these rich networks of relations that we're in.
Well, I have two things I want to say about that. And first thing, I know you talk about entangled empathy and seeing the animal as an animal as a different thing, not necessarily as the same to us. And what I found was that people that view the animal as an animal, that don't hurry to call it a baby, that don't necessarily think about it as a person, are those usually that don't drastically change their relationships with the animals after the baby. Because if we call the animal a baby, and then a human baby is born, then we'll be like the hairdresser from Texas that got confused, right? We need to set our boundaries. But if we don't call it a baby, if we call it a live being with whom we have a different kind of relationship, then we don't have to alter it, at least not as drastically. Maybe we won't have as much time to give it attention, but that happens with older siblings, for example, as well. So we change our relationship, but we don't transform it so drastically. The other thing I wanted to say, yeah?
I just want to ask you, so the people who call it a baby, were they tended to be couples who didn't have children as yet, and therefore this was their baby, or were there also couples who did have children who continued to refer to their pet as a baby?
Well, when they did have children, they usually didn't talk about it as their baby, but they talked about it as their child's sibling. So it was still a child, but it was a companion to their child and a family member through their child, and not necessarily through them. And there was always a need to create a differentiation. So if they had a baby, it was either not a baby or a baby but not my baby.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they needed to set some kind of difference in that. The other thing I wanted to do, and maybe this will make it a little bit clearer, because I think what a lot of the I don't know if confusion, but maybe it's hard to get down to exactly what I'm trying to do, is because there isn't really the context here of my entire project. I mean, one small article, and my entire project deals with emotion, first of all, and the emotional relationship we create with animals. And the idea was to understand through these emotions how we set boundaries between ourselves and other animals. That is, what kind of emotional relationships are culturally acceptable and why. So the article you read is basically one chapter that deals with one form of trans-species love, let's call it that. That is loving animals as family members, and specifically children. But I also deal with loving animals as, let's call it spiritual beings, and I deal mainly with Jewish tradition versus animistic tradition, and whether or not in Judaism we can see the animal as having a certain sense of self, personhood, or soul. Another part deals with animals as friends and companions, dealing a lot with what I mentioned a little bit, unconditional love, for example, and also a lot about anthropomorphism, how we ascribe certain characteristics we want in friends onto these animals. And then the last one deals with the ultimate transgression of these boundaries, and that is seeing the animal as a partner, as a true partner, as even a sexual partner, and why this is so threatening to us. And through these four categories, what I try to show is that there's certain ways of loving animals that are acceptable, and certain ways that are really, really not acceptable. In fact, one of the last persistent animals. And in Judaism, also loving them as gods is unacceptable at all. And in fact, in Judaism, usually religious Jews won't, or ultra-Orthodox at least, religious Jews won't even have pets, so as not to confuse the love of the animal with the love of God. What I try to show through these different categories is the location of these boundaries and how strong and persistent they are, and even when we try to seem as if we're transgressing them by incorporating them into our families, by treating them as persons, by treating them as babies, we really aren't. And maybe that gives you a wider frame to kind of explore the setting of this article.
Did you want to jump in, Craig? I know that you were scribbling earlier, and I saw the wheels turning.
So yeah, it strikes me in the constitution of families, we need roles for animals to take, right? So people are constantly sort of calling them babies, but I think also of more complicated kinds of families, not your sort of conventional nuclear family, or even within your conventional nuclear family. What about the care for physically and mentally disabled children and adults, which looks very similar to me to the way that people care for dogs and cats, which isn't necessarily about the infantilization of the animal itself, although comparable in sort of a broader way of understanding infantilization. And I guess the real keystone for that to me is something you touched on, is the sexuality or the sexual life of dogs, cats, adult children, and, well, children as well, or infants, right? Things that, as you said, we can't really quite talk about. So thinking further, and maybe building on your example of the parrot coming on her hand, examples of breeders who have to masturbate a dog, use a male stud into a cup, and then they inseminate the female. Humans are intimately implicated in the sexual lives of animals, but pets are often very much more ambiguously existent in this realm, I think, and I think that tells us a lot about people's desire to, that is, pet owners' desire to maintain a certain sort of buffer around their animals, that they don't ever become sexual beings. Anyway, so ultimately, I think this is telling us a lot about family, as much about the family as it is telling us about what exactly are animals. It's telling us more about what are we, and what are we in this sort of custodial relationship. So I'd love to hear more about what you have to say about the sexuality of animals and humans living together.
Well, I'm kind of looking at Peter and grinning because he had reviewed Decker's book and written a very short and somewhat controversial piece reviewing that book. And he also deals with cognitively disabled and got some flack on that. Interestingly, I did write an article that talks about these two together, and I guess I was a little too afraid to publish it. Maybe someday, because it will be quite controversial. The thing is that with sexuality, what I show, and I've done some research among the zoophile community, especially the internet zoophile community. These are people that treat their animals not just as, you know, sexual partners, but as emotional partners. They view their animals as one would view a spouse. And the reason I did this research, even though they weren't from Israel, because people from Israel wouldn't come up to me, it's a very small country, what I wanted to do was talk about zoophiles. And why I wanted to talk about them was to hear people's reactions. So I talked about them in conferences, and I published papers, and I talked about them in classrooms, and I wanted to see how people were reacting, and maybe you can imagine that they weren't reacting very well. So there are different kinds of reaction. One of them is laughter, of course. This is a kind of humorous situation to think about a human and an animal together. Another is disgust, and another is outrage, and also personally attacking me as someone that dared to do research on the topic, and I'm sure wondering what I do in private with my dogs. And it really helps that I kind of have this, you know, innocent face, and I'm married with 4 kids, and otherwise it would be a very compromising thing to talk about. And not a simple one, because this really is taboo. And what I show through this research on zoophilia is that the reason this is, I find, so troubling, and Peter, I think you wrote that this is about crossing boundaries, but it's even more than that. It's treating the animal as an equal. It's treating the animal as something that is not inferior to us. What is a baby? A baby is something that we can control, that we need to teach it. We need to elevate it to being a real person, to give it culture. It's something that is weak, that is inferior. And once we see the animal as completely equivalent to us, or on the same status, that we can really create a real equal relationship with, I think that's when it becomes really threatening. And the examples you gave about artificial insemination, for example, show us that this isn't about sexuality necessarily. Because we can do all these sexual stuff to animals. We really do horrible things to animals, sexual things to animals, and they're okay because we do it while still seeing the animal as a subject or object that we can use. Once we're saying, hey, this is my partner, I see it as equal to me, then it becomes really disturbing in a way. And what I do in the article when I talk about the cognitively disabled people is show that the cognitively disabled still exist on the same continuum. For example, we have tests to check their cognitive age and to check, of course, their physical age to see whether or not it is legally okay to have sexual relationships with these people. And if it is, then it is, and if it is, then it isn't. With animals, we don't have that. We don't care if it's dolphins or elephants or another incredibly intelligent creature. We don't care if they're mature sexual beings. And it's a very different situation in the end, because with animals, we're not saying they're not capable of having sexual relationships. They can, just not with humans. And with the mentally or cognitively disabled, we're saying they're not capable of, you know, making these decisions. I hope this isn't too confused, but what I'm trying to show here is that this taboo basically shows us, as you said, a lot more about what it means to be human than about our relationships with animals. Really, that's what I'm trying to show you.
Right.
Can I just make a just a little comment? It's a more really a graphic comment. In the special issue of Hypatia on Animal Others, we published an article by Kathy Ruddy, which is really about loving animals in a more erotic way, and talks about both bestiality and zoophilia. It was in a feminist journal. It was quite controversial, but it got through the various review processes. So I want to just encourage you to continue to think about publishing that, Dafna, because it can happen.
Yeah, no, I think just the combination with cognitively disabled people, I think that's a little too much for people to handle. That specific situation, writing about zoophilia is something that I do, even though, yes, it is quite controversial.
Actually, on that cognitive disabled question, it's something that both Craig and Dafna have brought up. I want to turn it back to you again, Peter, because I think maybe your writings on personhood also sort of grapple with it in this human context. So on the FAQ part of your website, this is also one of the controversial things that you have written about. You're quoted as saying, killing a detective and is not morally equivalent to killing a person. Sometimes it's at all. And you've got a response on the website, and I was wondering if you might engage with that in this context too.
Yeah, that's a very old quote, and I certainly would not use the word defective anymore. That's a fairly normal language referring to people with, say, intellectual disabilities in the 1970s, and I think it's now been recognised, and I would recognise it as not appropriate language. But I do think that, you have to ask questions about what is it that makes it more seriously wrong to kill some beings than others. And people do think that it's more seriously wrong typically to kill human beings than to kill non-human animals. I don't think you can justify that simply on the basis that, well, they're members of the species Homo sapiens. That doesn't seem to be a morally crucial divide. If you accept species membership, then why don't you accept, being Caucasian makes it more serious to kill not being Caucasian. They're both ways of drawing biological boundaries around our group, happen to be Caucasian. I think we ought to reject that having moral significance. So it would be more promising to say that it's more serious to kill beings who are persons in the Lockean sense, that is, beings who are aware of themselves over time, plan for the future, therefore have their plans thwarted if they're killed, or are autonomous beings, something like that. That's a more promising angle. But if you accept that, then you've no longer got a boundary of the most serious cases of killing that perfectly parallels the boundary of our species, because you'll have clearly some non-human animals, again, great apes would be good candidates, who are more aware of themselves and existing over time than some profoundly intellectually disabled beings. So that's the basis of the rotation. And I do think that to defend that, and I think that there are some cases anyway where pretty much every neonatal intensive care unit would agree you ought not to keep a baby alive, or it's permissible to withdraw treatment because of the profound intellectual disability that a massive brain hemorrhage that a premature newborn has. And that seems to me to be pretty much equivalent to agreeing with that judgment that sometimes it's not wrong to at least allow profoundly intellectually disabled infants to die. And I don't think there's a big difference between allowing them to die and giving them a lethal injection. That's obviously requires more argument to take that up. I do just want to comment a little bit on what Dafna said, though, and actually I wanted to amplify a little bit what Craig said about masturbating dog breeders. I think as we're not that far from Thanksgiving now, we ought to remember that virtually every turkey eaten in America is a result of exactly that. But the standard American turkey has been bred to have such a large breast that the male physically cannot copulate. So all of these large-breasted turkeys are the result of people who are working to masturbate the male turkeys and then grab the female turkeys and inject them with the semen. And if you've seen footage of that, it's actually a pretty brutal process. I know somebody who's worked for one day, he wanted to find out what it was like, so he got a job working for one day as a turkey inseminator. Basically, they were down the bottom of the pecking order in terms of their bosses. They were under constant pressure to do this as fast as they possibly could. And most of the workers then took out their frustration on the turkeys very roughly and still be treated quite often. So that's just one aspect of it. But the thing that's more interesting that Dafna said, I think, is the suggestion that the taboo on sex with animals is a result of the idea that somehow that makes them our equals. And I don't think that that can be right, because after all, we don't think that when white slave owners or their sons had sex with their female slaves, that made them regard the slaves as equals. Since it didn't. We probably don't think that when men go to prostitutes, that they regard the prostitute as their equal. So, although I agree with you that it's certainly breaking a taboo, and I think the taboo has something to do with our separateness from animals, I wouldn't say that it has to do with the idea that we're then treating them as equals. I think it maybe has more to do with the idea that we're recognizing that we are animals in some way, in that we can have sex with them, or we can use them sexually, or even some people may find them sexually attractive, and I would see that as the kind of the taboo being breached. So it's not. I mean, in a way, I'm agreeing with you that it's reducing the gap between humans and animals, but I wouldn't say that it's. I wouldn't say that it's because we're regarding them as equal.
Well, that's, if I may, that's why I differentiate between zoophiles and bestiality. I think that zoophilia is more troubling than bestiality. At least that's what I found. That is, we can forgive a 14-year-old boy that lives in the country and needs, some sexual outlet, and he chooses, I don't know, let's not get too graphic. But we'll say, okay, so he did what he did. He could have done it with a shoe or with his hand or whatever. It's a little weird, but okay. But when someone has a real relationship, real loving relationship, and says, this is my life partner, I think that is more troubling to people. Because it's not just about the sexual act. I think that's when we start looking at this person as threatening. That's when we decided it's really illegal. Of course, any sexual act with animals is often illegal in most countries, but a lot more so than any other horrible thing we'll do to an animal. And I think there are a lot of nuances here that we don't have time to really go into them right now, but that it is different when we talk about a real partnership between humans and animals than just, as you said, going to a prostitute. You talked about the slaves and their masters, so if it's just having a sexual relationship, of course it's not elevating it to say slaves are persons like us, but if we marry this, isn't that a lot more threatening than if we have sexual relationship?
Yeah, I think that is interesting that you find that people think of this as more threatening, and it would be really good to get some research on that. And I don't want to get you into trouble, but I do think it would be good to publish something on that issue if you can actually document the fact that people have a stronger reaction to what, from my perspective, ought to be the less troubling relationship, right? Because where there is cruelty to the animal, and a lot of the sex with animal may involve gross cruelty to animals. People perform sexual acts with chickens, which will basically kill the chickens, or certainly be brutal towards them. But that seems to me much more troubling than an act which You know, we may find abnormal, we may find disturbing in various ways, we may think it's not, you know, that would be better for people to have relationships with humans in some way, but you know, there is this strange thing that people are going to object very violently to people performing loving acts with animals to whom they are well-intentioned and whom they treat well, and they don't think anything wrong with people performing acts of the kind I described that, you know, factory farming will perform, that obviously cause the animals much more suffering.
So I've got one more question back to Dafna about pets as flexible persons, but then I also want to open it up and give the audience a chance to jump in if you have questions for Dafna or for any of the other panelists. So Dafna, one of the things I really like about your article is that it's so empirically rich. So you focused on 52 pet-owning couples in southern Israel over the 6-year period from 2001 to 2007. You've got 3 key stories in there where you're talking about animals as pre-child, semi-child, and substitute. But I can imagine with that much empirically rich fieldwork, you have all sorts of stories that didn't make it into this article. So I'd just like to hear some more of the ethnographic description that you offer us here to talk more about this notion of animal as pre-child, semi-child, child substitute, and illustrating this idea of flexible personhood.
Well, yeah, I mean, I you know, with one of the informants that I think I called her Tamar in my article. I mean, I went walking yesterday. I mean, these relationships are still enduring, and I'm still examining how the relationships with animals are changing over time, and it has been really interesting. I think a lot of the interesting ethnographic data that didn't really make it into the article has to do with anthropomorphizing of the animals. The way they're seen, yes, as children, but it's also played. One of my favorite examples is when pet owners, a husband and a wife, were discussing the political inclinations of their animals. Animals they had since they were kids. So they were saying, oh, he's leftist and he's kind of mainstream and he's a bully, so he would vote for this and that. These relationships are something that is really played with. It's really enjoyed. They discuss what the literary differentiation of animals, what they would read if they could, what kind of personality they have, and it's, some of it is half jokingly, but some of it isn't. For example, they would ask me to replay the recording of their animals so that they could hear themselves barking, or they could feel what they sounded like on the recording. There was a real way of engaging with the animal that was a lot more than just saying, oh, it's a little baby. And that really didn't get into the article.
Craig, I see you're curiously writing again. Do you want to jump in?
I don't know. I'm still playing with the idea of flexibility. Now I'm thinking of pets as provisional persons, probably for its alliteration. But of course, you're thinking about children as provisional adults as well, and the sort of playing that we're always doing around identity and roles. And I wonder from a more multi-species ethnographic approach, which you said you were sort of interested in but didn't try to do in this project, you know, when do we see pets playing humans in the ways that humans play pets as humans? And I find that kind of fascinating question as well. What sort of social obligation do pets put on us? How do our sort of social roles start to shift and change in relationship to that? So it's not just placing the pets in the role as a child with a certain sort of set of expectations and obligations, but how are the pets themselves putting us in these sort of positions where we're feeling obligations to them? And again, that's all so contingent, and which sort of takes me back to the disposability of, maybe not the pet itself, but the disposability of its provisional status as a person, or as a certain kind of person. Anyway, so I don't know.
Yeah, and maybe on the notion of flexibility, I talked about Harvey in the beginning, but I was wondering if you also might like to talk about flexible persons in the context of Emily Martin's work on flexible bodies, or Aiwa Ong's notion of the flexible citizen. Could you maybe flesh that out a little bit more in conversation with what Craig was just saying?
Well, I think that when we were talking about Emily Martin's body, I think if I return to what I was saying before, flexibility, and I think Greg, that you were saying that too, flexibility is something that we really can relate to, something that we enjoy. And when we think about our bodies as flexible, that makes sense, something that we can even celebrate. And when we think about flexible relationships, flexible citizenship, these are things that give us options. And I think that's what makes flexibility such a useful and also relatable term. You get it. But what is important to me is to say that this flexibility it has its boundaries. It doesn't. You can't do whatever you want with this flexibility. When you go too far, you're punished. When you are too flexible with your body, you will be sanctioned. There are different ways of controlling your citizenship, your body, your relationship with animals, while allowing a certain amount of flexibility. There's also very clear ways that you're not allowed to be flexible anymore.
Let me give a shout out. There's a group here from Cornell. There's 6 people who came all the way here just for this event. Do any of you have any questions for speakers? Come a long way. No? Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for participating in a really interesting discussion. Also, 2 weeks from today, we've got our first chemical event in the Multispecies Salon. We're going to be talking about chemical species. So this is in association with a art exhibit that's going to open in Ehrenberg Hall 2 weeks from today. So we've got Nick Shapiro coming. We've got Ian from the engineering, I guess environmental engineering is his background. And we've also got an artist who has been making artworks with clay that she's taken from the Marcel Shale epicenter of the fracking pit. So we'll hear about formaldehyde detection techniques that you can use in your own home. And it's an opportunity also to explore the chemical term more broadly in ethnography. So again, thank you, Lori. Thank you, Dafna, for being on the line virtually, and a big round of applause for this remarkable article.
Thank you so much for Eben for organizing this.